Imagine a company that implements completely anonymous skill tests to prove bias exists, only to throw out the results when the data tells a different story than they wanted to hear. Here's how it all unfolded. Be me, 31. Name is Callahan, and I work as a senior software engineer at Nexus Technologies, a mid-sized tech company where I've spent the last 6 years building my skills and contributing to products that serve millions of users around the world. This story is about something that happened at my company that fundamentally changed how I think about fairness, meritocracy, and what those words actually mean when they're put to the test in the real world. What I witnessed taught me that some people only believe in objective measurement when the results confirm what they already wanted to believe, and that lesson has stayed with me ever since. Let me give you some background on Nexus Technologies and the culture that existed there before everything changed, because understanding the context helps explain why what happened felt like such a profound betrayal to those of us who experienced it. We were a software company of about 200 people, building enterprise solutions for businesses that needed reliable, scalable technology to run their operations, and the engineering team was the heart of everything we did. The culture had always been focused on technical excellence, where your code spoke for itself and your contributions were measured by the quality of your work rather than by any other factor. I joined Nexus right out of college and worked my way up through the ranks by doing good work, learning from senior engineers who mentored me, and gradually taking on more complex projects as my skills developed. The engineering team was diverse in the ways that mattered for building great software, people with different backgrounds, different specialties, different approaches to problem solving, all working together toward shared goals. Nobody really talked much about demographics because the focus was always on the work itself, on whether your code was clean and efficient, whether your solutions were elegant, whether you could be relied upon when things got difficult. About 2 years ago, new leadership came into the HR department in the form of Gwendolyn, a 44-year-old executive who had strong opinions about how technology companies should approach hiring, promotion, and talent development. Gwendolyn believed that the tech industry had systemic problems with bias that prevented qualified people from underrepresented groups from advancing, and she was determined to address those problems at Nexus. I want to be clear that I think those concerns are worth taking seriously, because bias does exist in many organizations and creating fair processes is a legitimate and important goal that benefits everyone. Gwendolyn's first major initiative was a comprehensive review of our hiring and promotion practices, looking for evidence of the bias she believed was present in how we evaluated talent and made decisions about people's careers. She brought in consultants, analyzed historical data, and presented findings to leadership that suggested our traditional evaluation methods might be favoring certain groups over others in ways that weren't justified by actual performance. The solution she proposed was something that sounded perfectly reasonable on its face, implementing blind assessments that would remove all identifying information and evaluate people purely on the quality of their work. The idea behind blind assessment was simple and compelling. If you remove names, backgrounds, and any other identifying information from the evaluation process, you eliminate the possibility that bias could influence the results. Whatever outcomes emerged from a truly blind process would reflect genuine merit and nothing else, providing objective data about who the most skilled contributors actually were. Gwendolyn championed this approach publicly, presenting it as a way to ensure that talent from all backgrounds would have an equal opportunity to demonstrate their abilities and be recognized for their contributions. The engineering team was generally supportive of this initiative because most of us believed in meritocracy and were confident that fair evaluation would validate the work we had been doing all along. Weston, one of our most talented engineers, was particularly enthusiastic about the idea, saying that he had always believed the best code should speak for itself regardless of who wrote it. There was a genuine sense of optimism that this process would demonstrate what many of us already believed, that our team succeeded because of talent and hard work, not because of any unfair advantages. The blind assessment system was implemented with great care and significant investment, bringing in external evaluators who had no knowledge of who had submitted which work and using standardized criteria that focused purely on technical quality. Every engineer in the company would complete a series of coding challenges and technical assessments, all submitted anonymously, with results scored by evaluators who saw only the work itself and nothing about the person who created it. Leadership made public commitments that the results of this process would be honored, that top performers would receive recognition and advancement opportunities based purely on their demonstrated skills. The assessment period lasted about 6 weeks, during which everyone completed their challenges and submitted their work through the anonymous system that had been set up specifically for this purpose. There was nervous energy throughout the engineering department as people waited for results, wondering how they would stack up against their colleagues when all the subjective factors were removed and only the work remained. I felt confident about my own submissions because I had put genuine effort into them, but there was still that uncertainty that comes with any evaluation where you don't control the outcome. When the results came in, they were compiled and analyzed before being shared with leadership, and what happened next is something I learned about gradually through conversations and observations over the following weeks. The data showed clear patterns in who had scored highest on the blind assessments, and those patterns apparently did not match what Gwendolyn and the HR team had expected or hoped to find. The top 10% of scorers, the people who had demonstrated the highest levels of technical skill according to the objective criteria that had been established, were predominantly from one demographic group. I want to be careful here about how I describe what happened because I don't want the story to be misunderstood as making claims about any group's inherent abilities or potential. What the data showed was the result of this particular assessment with this particular group of people at this particular moment in time, and there could be many explanations for those results that have nothing to do with inherent capability. But the results were what they were, objective measurements taken through a process specifically designed to be free from bias, and now leadership had to decide what to do with that information. The first sign that something was wrong came when the results weren't released according to the timeline that had been announced, with vague explanations about needing additional time for analysis and verification. Those of us who had been paying attention to the process started to sense that something unexpected had happened, though we didn't know the details until much later when the full story emerged. The optimism that had surrounded the blind assessment initiative began to fade as days turned into weeks, and the promised transparency about results failed to materialize. What was happening behind closed doors, as I later learned from colleagues who were closer to the decision-making process, was a crisis of narrative that the leadership team didn't know how to handle. The blind assessment had been implemented to demonstrate that bias was holding back talented people from underrepresented groups, but the results suggested something more complicated than that simple story. Instead of providing evidence for the narrative that had motivated the initiative, the data raised questions that were uncomfortable to confront honestly. Gwendolyn convened meetings with senior leadership to discuss how to respond to the results, and the options that were considered tell you everything you need to know about what was really being prioritized. One option was to honor the results as promised, recognize the top performers regardless of who they turned out to be, and accept that the data might not support the assumptions that had motivated the initiative. Another option was to find reasons to question the validity of the assessment itself, to argue that the methodology was flawed in ways that made the results unreliable and therefore unusable. The option that was ultimately chosen was to scrap the results entirely, claiming that the blind assessment had failed to account for important factors like soft skills, collaboration ability, and cultural contribution that couldn't be measured through technical challenges alone. A new evaluation process would be implemented, one that would include these additional factors, and that would involve human reviewers who would have access to information about candidates that the blind process had deliberately excluded. In other words, the solution to getting results they didn't like from an objective process was to reintroduce the subjective elements that the objective process had been designed to eliminate. When this decision was announced to the engineering team, it was framed as an improvement to the evaluation methodology, a recognition that technical skill alone wasn't sufficient to measure someone's full contribution to the organization. But those of us who had been following the process closely understood what had actually happened, that the results had been scrapped not because the methodology was flawed, but because the outcomes were politically inconvenient. The promise that top performers would be recognized based purely on their demonstrated skills had been broken before it had ever really been tested. Weston was one of the first to figure out what had happened, piecing together information from various sources to understand that he had likely ranked among the top performers in the blind assessment, only to have those results discarded. He came to me one evening after most people had gone home, visibly frustrated, asking whether I had heard what was going on and what I thought it meant for the culture we had believed in. I told him what I had observed and what I suspected, and we sat together processing the implications of working for a company that would throw out objective results when they didn't match the desired narrative. The trust that had existed between the engineering team and leadership began to erode rapidly as more people understood what had happened and what it revealed about the organization's actual values. We had been told that merit was what mattered, that the blind assessment would ensure fairness, that top performers would be recognized regardless of any other factor, and every one of those promises had been broken. The message that came through loud and clear was that your work didn't actually matter as much as fitting into a particular narrative, that objective excellence could be discarded when it became inconvenient. Emmerich, another top engineer who had likely scored well on the blind assessment, started interviewing at other companies within weeks of learning what had happened, not making a scene but quietly exploring his options. When I asked him about it, he said that he couldn't invest his career in an organization that had demonstrated so clearly that it didn't actually value what he brought to the table. He wasn't angry exactly, more resigned, like someone who had realized that a relationship wasn't what they thought it was and had decided to move on rather than try to change something that wasn't going to change. Saren was an engineer I had worked with for years, someone who I knew believed strongly in creating opportunities for people from all backgrounds, and who had initially supported Gwendolyn's initiatives. But even she was disturbed by what had happened, telling me that she had wanted fair processes, not manipulated ones, and that throwing out objective results wasn't fairness, it was just a different kind of bias. Her perspective mattered to me because it showed that the concern wasn't about opposing diversity or inclusion, it was about opposing dishonesty and manipulation regardless of what narrative they were meant to serve. Over the following months, the exodus began, not dramatically or all at once, but steadily as the engineers who had options decided to exercise them and find environments that would actually value their contributions. Weston left first, accepting an offer at Helix Systems that came with a significant increase in compensation and, more importantly, a culture that he believed would evaluate him honestly. Emmerich followed a few weeks later, then several others who had been top contributors and who no longer trusted that their work would be fairly recognized at Nexus. The people who left weren't the ones who couldn't perform elsewhere. They were precisely the ones who could perform anywhere, the high-value talent that every company wants and that Nexus had spent years developing. What remained after the exodus was a team that had lost many of its most capable members, facing the same project demands with fewer resources and less expertise to draw upon. Langford, our CTO, tried to stem the bleeding by offering retention bonuses and promotion opportunities, but the damage to trust couldn't be repaired with money alone. I had my own decision to make during this period, weighing my years of investment in Nexus against the reality of what the organization had revealed about its values through its actions. The work itself was still interesting, and my colleagues who remained were still good people, but there was something fundamentally broken about working for a company that would manipulate evaluation processes to achieve predetermined outcomes. I started exploring my options quietly, not out of anger, but out of a clear-eyed assessment that my long-term career would be better served by an environment that genuinely valued merit. The irony of the situation was profound and didn't escape those of us who had watched it unfold from the inside. The blind assessment had been implemented to eliminate bias and ensure fairness, to create a system where only the quality of your work mattered and nothing else could influence how you were evaluated. But when that system produced results that challenged certain assumptions, the response was to eliminate the system rather than question the assumptions, which was itself a form of bias more blatant than anything the system had been designed to prevent. Helix Systems, the competitor that hired Weston and several other departed engineers, became a destination for Nexus talent precisely because of what had happened at Nexus. Word spread through professional networks about the blind assessment debacle, and Helix positioned itself as an alternative where technical excellence was genuinely valued and objective evaluation was actually honored. They weren't just hiring away Nexus engineers. They were building a reputation as a meritocracy at a time when that word had been revealed as hollow at their competitor. The business impact of the talent drain became impossible to ignore as projects fell behind schedule, quality issues increased, and the institutional knowledge that had walked out the door couldn't be easily replaced. Ashford, the CEO, eventually intervened to address what had become a crisis, though by then much of the damage had already been done and the most valuable people had already moved on. Gwendolyn's role was quietly reduced, not with any public acknowledgement of what had gone wrong, but with a kind of organizational reshuffling that executives use when they need to change direction without admitting mistakes. I eventually made my own move, accepting a position at a smaller company where the culture genuinely reflected the meritocratic values that Nexus had only pretended to hold. The decision wasn't easy, because I had invested 6 years in Nexus and had many good memories and relationships from that time, but the blind assessment incident had broken something that couldn't be repaired. When I left, I did so professionally and without burning bridges, but I was honest in my exit interview about why I was leaving and what I thought the organization needed to learn from the experience. Looking back on this experience now with some distance and perspective, I've thought a lot about what it taught me about fairness, meritocracy, and the difference between genuine values and performative ones. True fairness means accepting results even when they're not what you expected or hoped for, because if you only accept results that confirm your prior beliefs, you're not actually committed to fairness at all. Meritocracy is easy to believe in when it produces outcomes you like, but its real test comes when it produces outcomes that challenge your assumptions, and that's when you find out whether you actually believe in it or not. I also learned something important about trust and how quickly it can be destroyed when people realize that the rules they were told to play by aren't the rules that are actually being applied. Every engineer who participated in that blind assessment did so in good faith, believing that their work would be evaluated fairly and that top performers would be recognized as promised. When that promise was broken, it didn't just affect the people whose high scores were discarded, it affected everyone who had believed in the process and who now knew that belief had been misplaced. For anyone watching this who finds themselves in a similar situation, where you've realized that your organization's stated values don't match its actual behavior, I want you to know that you have options and that your skills have value. You don't have to stay in an environment that doesn't genuinely respect your contributions, and there are organizations out there that actually do value merit and honest evaluation. The job market for talented people is always better than you might think, and the confidence to explore your options is often the first step toward finding something better. For anyone in a leadership position, I hope this story illustrates the danger of implementing processes you're not actually willing to honor when they produce unexpected results. If you're going to promise objective evaluation, you have to be prepared to accept objective results, even if those results challenge assumptions you hold dear. The alternative is to destroy trust in a way that drives away exactly the people you can least afford to lose, the high performers who have the most options and the least tolerance for dishonesty. The company I work for now is smaller than Nexus, but has a culture that actually reflects the values of honest evaluation and genuine meritocracy that Nexus only claimed to have. Performance reviews are straightforward, feedback is honest, and when assessments are done, the results are honored regardless of what they show about who performed best. It's not a perfect organization because no organization is, but there's a fundamental integrity to how people are evaluated that I didn't realize I had been missing until I found it. Several of the people who left Nexus during the exodus have ended up at my current company or at similar organizations that have benefited from the talent that Nexus drove away. We sometimes talk about what happened and what we learned from it, and there's a shared understanding that the experience, as painful as it was, clarified something important about what kind of environment we wanted to build our careers in. The best thing that came out of a bad situation was the clarity it provided about what actually matters and the motivation to find places where those things are genuinely valued. I don't know what eventually happened to Nexus, or whether they ever learned from the blind assessment debacle and rebuilt the trust that was destroyed during that period. I hope they did, because the people who remained there deserved better than to work in an environment poisoned by the knowledge that honest evaluation couldn't be trusted. But whatever happened to them, the lesson of that experience has stayed with me and continues to shape how I think about the organizations I choose to be part of. Thank you for listening to this story. It's one that I think about often because of how much it taught me about values, trust, and what fairness actually means when it's put to the test. If this resonated with you, or made you think about your own experiences with workplace evaluation and meritocracy, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Take care of yourselves, trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right, and I'll see you in the next one.